My name is Ayaka, and I will be running this portion of class today. First off, thank you all for joining tonight. Hi, Alyssa. My name is Ayaka, and I am a consultant with LSAT Unplugged, and I'm excited to welcome in Laura Hosid. I hope I'm saying your last name correctly, and please correct me if I am not. Laura currently works as an independent college and law school admissions advisor and is the founder of Campus Maven. That's a newsletter that offers college guidance through a Jewish lens. So so happy to have you here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us today, Laura. I know I've said a little bit of an introduction for you right now, but if you would like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to here.
Sure. Yeah, I will give you some of my more law school relevant backgrounds. I went to undergrad at University of Pennsylvania and then went to actually did my first year of law school at Georgetown Law School and then transferred to NYU where I finished my degree. Worked at a couple of different law firms. Realized pretty quickly that that wasn't the right path for me and started working in law school career services. And I worked at a number of different law schools at Penn, at Catholic, at American, mostly at Georgetown. Those were a couple temporary jobs. And then I was at Georgetown University Law Center. They let me back even after I transferred. And I worked in the career services office for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years. And then I transitioned to doing college admissions and law school admissions in a private company, basically when I started having kids. But I also spent a couple of semesters helping out as the pre-law advisor at Georgetown's undergrad campus, really in the past 3 or 4 years, as they transitioned when someone left and they needed someone to fill in, and I helped train a new person. So I have, stayed in touch with Georgetown and been working with a lot of undergrads. Yeah, that pretty much brings you up to date.
Wonderful. Oh my gosh, there's so much to dig in there. I'm like excited. Well, thank you for sharing all of that with us. And before I kind of dig into the meat of the thing, I'd like everyone in this room to know that they're all welcome to send in questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to address them or get to them by the end of the hour today. So with all this experience that you've had, Laura, which is amazing, and I want to ask so many questions, you probably come into contact with a lot of students who are like, oh, I'm thinking about law school, or I really want to apply to law school. Where would you say, in your opinion, what makes a person ready to apply to law school? I know it's a general question, but
yeah, I mean, I think, I always start by sort of talking through where did this come from? Like, are you one of those students who has always known you wanted to go to law school? Is this something new? And, why do you want to go to law school? Do you have some sort of idea of what you want to do with this law degree and whether what you want to do even requires a law degree? Obviously, if you want to be a practicing lawyer, you need a law degree. And, have you thought through whether you want to go directly from undergrad, or do you want to take some time off? And that was, when I would meet with undergrads, that would be a lot of my discussion. Sometimes students come to me now where they've already been out of school for a couple of years. And, when you've been out for a couple of years, those I guess they're not students anymore, but those clients tend to have a clearer idea of why they want to go to law school. So with the undergrads, it's really sort of talking through, like, and I always say I'm trying to help students not make the same mistake I made, which was I didn't really have a good reason for going to law school. I went straight from undergrad. I just, I did well on the LSAT. I didn't really have anything else to do. And, that's not really a particularly good reason for going to law school. So I try to help students really kind of think it through. And I do kind of approach everything with this career mentality just because of my background in career services. But I do think it's important. I mean, it's a big investment of time and money. And so thinking through, it's not that you need to know exactly what you want to do with your law degree, but at least having an understanding of what the options are and what's out there and what's motivating you, I think is helpful.
And I would love to double click on this idea of like the why law school. A lot of times when we think about the application to law school, that's something that we all ask ourselves and saying like, oh, we have to write that in our personal statement in some way or another. And I know you just said, you don't need to have like the absolute answer to that question, but how solid do you think that needs to be in terms of like, should we have a career in mind? Or is it more like I'm interested in law? Is that good enough? What's the gauge?
I mean, I don't think just I'm interested in law is good enough, because you're right. You do need to give the admissions committee some sort of glimpse into why you're applying and convince them that you're serious, because there are plenty. It's different from the undergrad admissions process in that I would say the vast majority of people who apply to college go to college, whereas a lot of people will apply to law school and they're just exploring options and they don't ultimately enroll, or they go for a year or a semester and then don't finish. So you do need to convince the admissions committee that you know what you're getting into and you genuinely are interested in law. I don't think you need to tell them like, hey, I want to be a tax lawyer, unless you do want to be a tax lawyer. And I think back to actually my my personal statement, which I dug up recently, was all about communications law and how, because I was a communications major in undergrad, how I wanted to practice communications law. I never practiced communications law. I don't know what I was thinking, but I guess they bought it. So, and I'm certainly not advocating that anybody lie, but like if it's a credible story that is
Mhm.
possible based on your background, I think that's fine. It doesn't You're not making a commitment. Like nobody was going to hold me to the idea of practicing communications law. And I really believed it at the time. I just,
Mhm.
got to law school. And, many of you probably know this already, but the first year of law school, you just, everybody takes the same classes. So, you know, that's your time to sort of start exploring what's out there. So you really don't need to know exactly what area of law you want to do. And you know, even within different areas of law, substantively, there's different practice settings. So, you could be a tax lawyer, but you could work in the government, you could work at a big firm, you could work at a small firm, you could work at a nonprofit, you could work in-house. And that's true for most different areas. So there's sort of two factors there. And I don't think you need to commit to anything, but at the same time, you need to have something to say in your application.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And it's kind of hard to first start thinking about the why, like a concrete why, but when you start writing about it and thinking about it, it gets a little bit more concrete, I think. So it's great insight. And then something else you mentioned, when you were in the career services office at Georgetown Law, did you see a value in or advantage or disadvantage in people who've taken a year off, maybe a couple years off, or maybe had a totally different career before deciding to go to law school? Can you give a little bit of insight there?
Yeah, and it varies. And I did work with the evening section of the law students for a while. And so most of those students had taken time off. And I would say employers do really value students who've taken time off. I think, um, in one sense, if you have done something during that time that is directly relevant to what you want to practice, well, then there's an obvious value to it. But I think that employers also, if you did anything during that year or two, I think they realize that one, you've got a little bit of maturity and real world experience that is an asset in a legal career, even if it is totally irrelevant. It's just, general life experience. Also, I think sometimes those students are a little bit more certain about like why they want to be in law school, because they had to make sort of a more affirmative choice to go back and apply to law school versus people like me who just went straight from undergrad. I do think that there's kind of a sweet spot. If you take too much time off, then it becomes a little bit more difficult, because then you've got someone who's going to, let's say, graduate from law school when they're you know 28, 29, 30, and go to a law firm and have to report to someone who's younger than them. And there's sort of this perception like, are they really going to be willing to like start out at the bottom, after they've had a successful career somewhere? That being said, these are broad generalizations, and certainly there are plenty of cases where having a long career can be valuable. It also just depends on what you want to do with your law degree. If you're working in the government and you want, to get a law degree to kind of supplement what you're doing, great. But if you want to fully start over and like go to a law firm and be an entry-level associate, I think sometimes having taken a lot of time off can be an issue. And I also don't want people to think that you can't go straight from undergrad to law school like I did. That is still perfectly fine, and plenty of students do that very successfully.
Right. And I get a lot of confidence in your answer there, because that question comes up of like, oh, is it okay to take an extra year? I want to work, or, I want to study for the LSAT while I'm working, and prep better for the application. And I think your answer kind of proves that, it's okay. Right?
Yeah, it's totally fine. And I think, sometimes students will come to me somewhat late in the application cycle, and I will say, have you thought about waiting? Because, there's an advantage to applying earlier in the application cycle, because most schools are making offers on a rolling basis. So, if it's already December, January, you might be better off waiting and applying in September the following year. If you want to retake the LSAT, let's say, that could be another reason to wait. And then this also comes up a lot if your grades are really important. And if you're applying directly from undergrad in the fall, you're really only applying with 3 years of college grades. And let's say you had a rocky freshman year, which a lot of people do, you might really want those senior grades to boost your GPA. So if you take a year off, then you're applying with 4 years of grades with, hopefully an upward trend, and that could be a real advantage.
Great. Awesome information. Last general question about applying. Whenever you start the application process, or anyone starts the application process, they're probably Googling best law school to go to, and you get the T14s, they're high LSAT scores, high GPA, high cost, they're all over the US. But how do you advise students to go about finding the right law school for them? And, perhaps it's not the T14, perhaps it's a more niche school that has a specific program. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, this is really a tough one for me, because with colleges, I am all about like, you have to find the right fit, and just, don't look at prestige. For law schools, I have to admit that prestige does play a role, and all things being equal, your job prospects are likely going to be better the higher ranked school that you go to. However, all things are not equal. And I often, particularly students who maybe have taken time off, or even, you're just a little bit older than you were when you applied to undergrad, and maybe you don't want to live in Charlottesville or Ann Arbor, or which are great places. I would love to go there, but maybe you have a significant other whose job is in Boston or DC, and there are reasons that you might choose a less prestigious law school that is in a more desirable geographic location. I think also, if you are someone who, let's say, knows that you are going to practice in the public sector and do something that is not particularly well paid after law school, that might be a reason to look at schools that maybe are ranked a little lower, but are going to offer you generous merit aid, and then you aren't going to need to pay as much or have as much debt. And I think sometimes looking at one of my students right now is really torn, because she knows she wants to work in DC after graduation for personal reasons, and also just the type of work that she wants to do is very DC based. But she has gotten into a higher ranked school in another city. And so the question becomes, is it worth going to a lower ranked school where she can be in DC, which gives her the advantage of, one, there's a whole lot of alumni from her school that are working in the city, which comes in handy with the job search. And she also has the ability to do internships during the school year that she wouldn't be able to do if she was, at the school in another city. So sometimes it can definitely make sense to not base your decision on rankings and prestige. But it does play a role with certain types of employers. As for like niche practice areas, I think that's obviously, that's certainly a thing, and certain law schools are known for having very strong intellectual property, or environmental law, or different programs, and that can certainly be a draw and a reason to go to a school. I don't think it's as crucial as, it is for undergrad, let's say, because you don't need to actually major in anything. And for the most part, like law school's training you to be a lawyer and to think like a lawyer and to learn to write and to learn to research, and, the actual subject matter specific stuff you can learn later on. And, every school's going to have some basic classes in most areas, but, some people are going to law school because they really are just passionate about learning a particular subject, or, being on a certain, type of journal, or doing a certain type of clinic that is only available at certain schools. And so that can definitely be a factor then.
Definitely. Lots to consider when we're looking at law schools, right? So I do want to get into kind of the application, and in relation to your current work. You sort of mentioned earlier about students coming to you for application assistance. When a student does come to you, what is the first thing you start with the student?
I mean, first I assess sort of, where they are in the process, because they come to me at different points. Some people are just, exploring whether to go, and others have already taken the LSAT, already have their list of schools, and we jump right into kind of brainstorming personal statement ideas. So it really just depends on where they are, but it's really about like getting all their ducks in a row. So, what are they doing about the LSAT? Have they taken it? When are they planning to take it? How are they studying for it? Have they reached out to professors or employers for letters of recommendation? That's, something that I think is really important and sometimes overlooked, and can be difficult if you are applying after having taken some time off. And so that's, a lot of times if I do talk to a student who's an undergrad and is thinking about waiting a few years, I will say, stay in touch with your professors, reach out to them now, like maintain those ties, because it is hard to go back a couple of years later, especially if you're at a big school where you don't know professors well. So LSAT, letters of recommendation, doing all the logistical things that you need to do as far as signing up for the like credential assembly service and whatnot, and getting your transcript sent from your undergrad to LSAC, and just, lining up all of those pieces. But it is a more straightforward process than undergrad. Like once you've got all those things moving, then you start to think about, okay, well, there's the personal statement, there's a resume, that's one of the first things that we get in shape as well, because you're going to need that for all of the applications, thinking about whether or not you're going to write a diversity statement, and if so, what is it going to be about? Do you have any issues that need to be addressed in character and fitness addendums? Do you have, LSAT addendums, GPA addendums, those types of things? And then the supplemental essays for the individual schools. And then, other things like interviews and, reaching out. The demonstrated interest in visiting schools is not really as big of a thing as it is with undergrad either, but it can play a role. So, just sort of figuring out which schools are on your list and what you could potentially be doing. A lot of them, will have all kinds of virtual information sessions now, which is nice.
Yeah, great. And in all those elements that, we have to pull together into our LSAC account, what, in your experience, takes the longest to do? Is it personal statement, LSAT studying? Like, what takes the longest for students?
I mean, probably LSAT studying or GRE these days, right? Some students can take the GRE, although I still recommend the LSAT, unless there's some compelling reason to go with the GRE. Yeah, so definitely, it's worth putting the time into preparing for the LSAT, because for better or worse, and, I'm not here to argue, which one it is, it plays a big role. If you're still in school, though, doing whatever you can to get strong grades, because that also plays a really big role. And then, after that, I would say the personal statement is the most important. The individual essays are important also, but the personal statement's going to all of the schools. So, that's something that we really, I spend a really long time on with students, kind of on the topic. The writing is important also, of course, but sometimes nailing down a good topic that's going to make students stand out and really give admissions committees a glimpse into this student's personality and, what they bring to the table and what they're, what kind of law student they're going to be, is really important.
Yeah, and so kind of double clicking into the personal statement, can you just kind of give a general overview of what the purpose of the personal statement is for admissions?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously you want to show them that you can write, so it needs to be well written. But you really, I mean, they know, or not that they know, but they have a good idea, or they think they know based on your grades and your test score, whether you are sort of academically, you've met the bar to be successful at their law school. So once you've cleared that bar, then they're looking at things like the personal statement. And, particularly at the top law schools, they could fill their class, many, many times over with people who have the necessary LSAT score and GPA. So the personal statement is your chance to distinguish yourself and show them, what you have to offer, what you bring to the table, how you're going to contribute to the law school class, and also kind of how you think and analyze, and just what you have to offer. And I often will ask students, like, well, what did you write your college essay about? Because it's a similar type of thing, except that it's usually more straightforward and does need to have a little bit of that element of like, okay, well, why, it can't just be like a random essay about pizza, which you could do for college. And it needs to have some tie to give them some understanding of why you're applying to law school.
Mm-hmm. And I know you talked about topic selection, especially with what's happened in the last 12 to 18 months with Black Lives Matter, COVID, Stop the Asian Hate, all of that. Are there common topics that you're like, maybe we want to stay away from or be very wary about how you write those essays?
I mean, and all of the ones you just mentioned, they're tricky. You can certainly write about them, but what I'll always say this to, wanting to say students, but they may or may not be students, to clients, is, what does this say about you? Like, are you saying something that anyone else could write also, who, lived through this time or watched the news? Like, I want to know how it impacted you. And, don't write about like living through a pandemic if it did, like, we all lived through a pandemic. So write about it if it affected you, and tells the admissions committee something about you that's interesting. But if anybody else could write the same essay, it's not a very good essay.
Right. And I think this goes similar, but getting essays that get a little bit too political or making political statements, do you think that's a no go there? Any insight there?
Yeah, so that, I usually say, well, it can be risky, right? Like, you don't know who's reading your essay and what their views are. One would hope that wouldn't, that they wouldn't be biased, but readers are human. But my point also is like, well, if you, if a law school is not going to accept you because of your political views, is that somewhere where you would be comfortable spending 3 years, where you would want to be? Sometimes that comes up with, like, if you're a member of a certain group, or certain, if you intern for a certain, political party, should I put that on my resume? And I always say, well, if the law school is not going to, if they're going to reject you because you were in, Hillel, the Jewish group, like, well, then do you want to be there? Like, it's.
Yeah, I mean, that's great insight. And, we always get those questions in these classes. And thank you for answering that so eloquently.
Sometimes people say no, like, I still want to be there, so I'm not going to put it on my resume, and that's fine. That's their choice.
Right, yeah. And then one question for people who've worked for a little bit. I've worked for about 5, now going on to 6 years, and I'm applying to law school this coming cycle. And my resume technically doesn't fit into one page. I've had a couple jobs, and so a lot of times I see personal statements that are kind of like a resume where they kind of run through all the jobs they've had and accomplishments that they do? Like, what's your thought on that?
I think that's a complete waste. I really do. I don't think that is the point of the personal statement. I think you're just wasting an opportunity. If you have a good resume, the resume should be able to tell that story. And the personal statement should be something more personal. I don't, and that is often feedback that I give after a student's first draft is this reads like a chronological history of your life, like going through your resume, and you don't need that.
Yeah. So do you recommend going more in depth with an experience or a story, something like that? Right.
Yeah. Maybe pick one of your experiences and explain, how, tie it to your interest in the law, or explain like what you learned from it. It's, there's a lot of different ways you can go that, you never want to be repeating yourself, because again, it's just a wasted opportunity. So, if your diversity statement is going to talk about some element of your life, well, then don't talk about that in your personal statement also, because that's,
Mhm.
you might as well use those opportunities to talk about two different things.
Yeah. Show different sides of yourself. Right. So,
Yeah, you want to give them as much information as possible,
mhm.
to make you stand out from all of these other applicants with the same grades and test scores.
Right.
So the more
Yeah.
you can stand out, the better, and the more they can make a sort of human connection with you, um, the more likely they are to want to have you as part of their 1L class.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like, it's an application, but you're trying to make a human connection, which, yeah, it's hard to do on writing, but yeah, that's why it's part of the application. And going to diversity statements,
Mhm.
what would you say the purpose of the diversity statement is for admissions?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this misconception that unless I can't write a diversity statement unless I fall into one of these three things that you typically, underrepresented minority groups that you typically think of when you think of diversity. And I don't think that's true. I think, law schools are looking for a diverse 1L class in many senses of the word. I mean, they're looking for students who bring different and unique perspectives to the discussion in the classroom. And so I've had students write I mean, of course, I've had students write diversity statements on, the things that first come to mind as diversity, but I've had students write, I had a student who lived in a bunch of different parts of the US growing up because her father was in the military, and she wrote about it from that, the perspective that she gained from having lived in the rural South and in a big Northeast city and in California. And it was really interesting. I've had I had a student who was a math major who kind of wrote about how that just gave her a different perspective on the law. And I had a student who was female, and in generally, I don't think writing oh, I'm female and that's why I'm diverse that doesn't always work. But she had taken some time off and worked in a very male dominated industry. And so she kind of wrote about it from what she learned from that perspective. And so I think if you think about it as, does whatever I'm writing about show them that I'm going to bring a unique perspective to classroom discussion? Then I think it's worth writing about. At the same time, sometimes I have students where it would do more harm than good what they're thinking about writing. If you just write something like, oh, I am a woman, and that's, we suffer discrimination, and just some kind of generic, that's probably going to do more harm than good. So if it's too forced, then don't do it.
Got it. And so I'm getting that you don't have to be a group that's been discriminated against to write this diversity statement. Okay.
Absolutely not. No, that is, I really don't think that is what they, I think that is what people typically think, but I think there's so much more to diversity. And there's some really creative things you can do with it. And as long as it fits that, I am going to bring a unique perspective to classroom discussion kind of test, I think, again, it's your chance to it's your chance to give them more information. I had a student come to me, and he had already gotten into a few. He wasn't happy with the results he was getting,
Mhm.
and he had really great scores and um, GPA and everything. And so he wanted me to kind of take a look at his application as a whole and tell him what I thought he did wrong. He grew up gay in a like super conservative religious community in like the rural Midwest, and he didn't write a diversity statement. And I was like, you need to write one now and speak to all the schools you haven't heard from.
Mhm.
And he's gotten into some of the T14 now, which he hadn't at the time. And I'm not saying that that was the reason, but I think it was a complete missed opportunity to have written the diversity statement.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it might not hinge on the diversity statement, but it adds to that human connection. Right?
Just gives them more. It's just another opportunity. You want to tell them anything you can do to give them more
Mhm.
information you want to do. So it just gave him basically an excuse to give them another essay.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And sort of connected, but we always get this question, is it okay to write about something that was a challenging circumstance, an event that was challenging? And what is the threshold of too much personal detail?
Yeah. I think yes, challenge is okay. If you have overcome it and it is not something that is going to potentially raise any red flags as far as your ability to be successful in law school. So if you are, newly sober and write about your struggle, like I would be a little wary of that, just because, that's a problem in the legal profession. If it's something that was recent, like it might raise a red flag to them that you're not ready to, take on such a, new and challenging endeavor. But that also comes back to like, well, if if you if 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 you want to put that out there and take your chances, go for it. Um, so I think just it depends on what the challenge is or was, and how recent it was, and kind of what you learned from it. And then if it's relevant to what you want to do. For example, I had a student a few years ago who had dealt with significant like sexual harassment issues, and that related to what she wanted to do with her law degree. So, she didn't go into a whole lot of detail,
Right.
but in that, it made sense to give a little bit of that story.
Mhm. Right. Okay. And just pivoting a little bit to, character and fitness addendas that, people may feel like they need to write. How much do people need to disclose first? I think is the
But everything, anything and everything. It is way better to disclose than to ever have an issue later on where there comes up something that you maybe were supposed to have disclosed, because there's issues with being admitted to the bar. So way better to over disclose than under disclose.
Mhm. And in the character and fitness statement or an addenda, do you need to address every single, let's say you might have a little bit of a rap sheet from years ago, let's say, for example, do you need to explain out and how, and we get this a lot, how do you make it sound like it's not making excuses for what's
I mean,
happened?
it depends on what it is, right? Like nobody cares if you were cited for underage drinking. Like just, you know,
Right.
2 lines. Like it was stupid. I was young. I learned my lesson. Like there's nothing to say. You don't need to go into any detail. Nobody cares if you have a speeding ticket for going 10 miles over the speed limit. If you have a reckless driving where you were going 120 miles an hour, well then, that might require a little bit more of an explanation. The trickier things are anything involving dishonesty. Um,
Mhm.
I had a student who had a plagiarism issue in college. That's troubling and needs to be addressed. But the things that the law school just really doesn't care about, don't go into any detail. Just disclose it, because better
Right.
to do it than not. But they really do not want to read much detail
Right.
about it. There's I forgot what it's called, but there's this great podcast with someone from, I believe, like Yale Law Admissions and Harvard Law Admissions. I can send it to you. I can't remember the name of it, but they do a bunch of episodes on things like this. And like one of them I listened to recently, they talked about all the different like character and fitness admissions they'd seen and like what they want to see. And yeah, basically short and sweet, and nobody cares about some of the things that most people have on the record.
Got it. And then a little bit of a softer issue, but people who want to write addendas about LSAT scores, grades, breaks they may have had in undergrad, about those, how can people write about it without it sounding like, you were just irresponsible and didn't get good grades, or stuff like that? How can we give better context than that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends on what it was. And like, sometimes it can do more harm than good. Like if you had like, 1 B- freshman year, like don't write an essay, you don't need to explain that. If there's certain things that are going to be obvious from your transcript that you really don't need to explain if there was like a clear upward trend. But if you had a semester where you had a death in the family, you had an illness, like, and that's why your grades are lower that semester, or if you started out pre-med or engineering and didn't do so well and then switch majors, like there might be a little bit of context that makes sense to convey without being defensive at all. It's just like, hey, started out as engineering, didn't do well, realized that wasn't for me, and pivoted, and you can see my grades have gone up since then, in my humanities courses. But no, you never want to be, you never want to put the blame on any, oh, I had this terrible professor, that kind of thing.
Right.
So it's just a judgment call as to whether it's worth calling attention to whatever it is, or not. And same thing with the LSAT. Like, what are you going to say? Like if you took it once and you took it twice and your score went up dramatically, like it might be worth explaining like what you did in the interim to improve your score, just so they're not like, oh well, maybe this one was a fluke, the higher one was a fluke.
Right.
Or if you were really ill the first time you took it. I mean, if there's context that's relevant, I think it's worth sharing in a very short and sweet and concise manner. But if there's like, I just drank a lot my freshman year, didn't go to class, like don't.
Right.
It's
not a great addenda, right?
So they'll figure that one out on their own.
Right. Thank you for that. That's a really common question we get. So appreciate your insight. And I know you mentioned this a couple questions before, but kind of at the end of writing, your personal statement, diversity statement, all your secondary essays and all of that, and taking a step back and looking at your application as a whole, how important is that as part of your process as well as the student's process?
How important are all of the essays?
Well, more like stepping back and making sure that all the elements of the application make sense. They're covering different things, all of that.
Right. Yeah. No, I think you always want to be looking at your application as a whole. And, it's kind of, I alluded to earlier where you don't want to repeat things. So, a very common question I get is like, should I tailor the personal statement to each law school? And it depends. Like if the law school, if one of the supplemental questions is why do you want to go to Michigan Law School? Well, then no, you don't need to tailor the personal statement because you have this whole separate statement where you can write about that. If there isn't another opportunity to convey that information, then yes, like sometimes students will change, let's say the last paragraph of their personal statement and tailor it a little bit specifically to whatever law school they are looking at, because law schools want to know you've done your homework. but yeah, I always think you want to be looking at things as a whole. And for example, if you're, let's say one of your recommendation letters, is going to talk about, a thesis that you wrote or some significant research project. Like if that's going to be covered in depth in that letter, well, then maybe don't write one of your essays about it, because you're kind of duplicating the information. So definitely look at everything as a whole,
Got it.
and
And
maybe strategic, sorry, in getting like an additional letter of recommendation from some activity or an employer or something that can, sort of fill in a hole that's
Mhm. Yeah, and two things I want to cover in what you just said and kind of click deeper into that. Um, Customizing essays for schools, and you just mentioned, schools want to know that you've done your homework. How much information is enough? Because, I've seen students who write like a whole page and a half about the school, and it's almost like they swallowed a brochure. Some who just name drop a school. What's the happy medium there?
I tend to say like the last paragraph where it's kind of looking forward to like tying it together to like why you want to be in law school, where and maybe mention it, like if you are talking about, for example, this girl who, with the sexual harassment essay, and like who's interested in domestic violence, then like mentioning the domestic violence clinic or journal at the particular school, or a well-known professor who teaches in that area, or something specific about the school, not just like plugging in the name of the school. I don't think adds much value. um,
Mhm.
but 2 or 3 sentences that reference specific things at that school, or things the location could be part of it. Having the opportunity to turn on the hill or whatever, or if they have certain study abroad programs that, I had a student who was really interested in like international law with a focus on Japan, and this, law school had a study abroad program with a Japanese university. So
Mhm.
mentioning that.
Yeah, great. And then the other thing is letters of rec. How important are they? Your experience there and insight.
I do think they're important. I think students shouldn't panic if because I do work with a lot of students who go to, large public universities, and, maybe didn't think about it ahead of time. Sometimes if I meet with students early, like they can be a little strategic about what classes they choose to take senior year, and what relationships they develop, knowing that they're going to need a letter. But sometimes, it's after the fact, and they're like, I don't, my professors just don't know me that well. Just wasn't the type of school I was at. And so don't panic if that's you. But at the same time, I think they can be a way to stand out, because the law schools, at the end of the day, they really want to know what you're going to be like in the classroom. And a former professor is the best person to be able to talk about, you as a student in the classroom, your writing ability, your research ability. I think to the extent that you can choose a professor who, is from a class where you did substantial writing or research or both, because that is what's most important to law schools. I think, that is ideal. I also think particularly if you have been out of school, I think it's important to have an employer letter of recommendation, which can be tricky because your employer may not know that you're applying to law school. And law schools understand that. So it's not like they get it. If you don't have a letter of recommendation from your like direct current boss, they can figure out why that might be. Um, but at the same time, I think that a letter from an employer, and if you're still in college or going directly from school, it could be from an internship supervisor or something. It talks about you in a different context, because while they're most concerned with what you're going to be like in the classroom and in law school, they also want to know that like you're going to represent the law school well when you are an alum and out in the working world. And so I think that gives them another side of you to evaluate.
Great. And for those students who've been out of school for quite a bit of time, and if their professor that they've built a connection with and built a relationship with, if they retire, is that still okay for them to write about them in the classroom?
Yeah, they don't. Yeah, I see that a lot. Like either they retire or they're at a different school or something like that, and that's fine. It doesn't matter where they are or what they're doing now. It's you know, because they're writing about you when they taught you.
And last question about letters of rec. If you know, most people usually send like, hey, can you talk about this in the letter of recommendation? And hopefully, and you know that the person can write a strong letter for you. But if you feel like somebody has written a subpar letter of rec, is it worth sending that into the school, or is it just going to do more harm than good? Insights there?
Yeah, I mean, so you won't see the letter in most cases. So, you know, that's a tough call to make, because ideally you're only asking someone if you think they could write a good letter. And if you don't see it, you have to just assume it's good. I definitely have had students where, you know, it's been like, let's say an outside letter, and like the person has sent it to them and they're like, this stinks. Like, this is just a generic letter. It's not, and we've decided like, yeah, don't even bother sending that. But with the professor letters in particular, you typically don't see them because they go, you know, straight through the school to LSAC. I do think that it is worth doing everything possible to make it as easy for the professor to write a good letter as possible. So, you know, sometimes they will be very direct about what they want from you. They'll have some sort of questionnaire, or they'll say, send me a resume. If they don't, I would have, you know, proactively offer that information, you know, maybe even saying, do you have time for, you know, a quick Zoom call, or, you know, life ever returns to normal, like, can I come by and buy you a cup of coffee? You know, offering to meet with them, offering to, you know, not only give them a resume, but some details about where you're applying, what you're interested in, maybe a list of like, here are the projects I did in your class. Here are the titles of the papers I wrote, you know, here, like, make it as easy as possible for them to write a very specific letter. Basically do the work. I mean, don't write the letter unless they ask you to, which is another story, but hopefully they won't. But just make it as easy as possible for them to personalize it.
Right. And I've had that experience with the professor. I had to list out all the classes I took with him, the papers that I've written. So, you know, it's common for
that. I mean, think about it. If you were the one writing it, like you would, you know, you would want to have all that information there, because then you can just plug it in really easily without having to go digging for it.
Absolutely. Well, this is great information. And last, kind of miscellaneous, I didn't know where to plug this in. But I know there are schools out there that offer early decision. Is that ever a good idea? When is it a good idea for students to consider? Does it affect financial aid? We'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, so, you know, many people are probably familiar with early decision from college applications, and I will say with college applications, it generally plays a bigger role. Like, it is usually very helpful. With law school applications, if a school that is your top choice offers early decision and you are not concerned with financial aid, then yeah, absolutely do it. It can, you know, how could it not increase your chances, right? Like, law schools want people who are going, they may tell you it doesn't help, but I mean, common sense would tell you that if you're a good candidate, they want people who they know are going to come. So it can definitely help. But you do give up the ability to compare financial aid offers, and you know, they'll also tell you it doesn't affect your merit aid or financial aid, but again, common sense, like, what incentive do they have to offer you money if you have to come? So I think it really only makes sense if it's your top choice and you're not concerned with the financial aspect. And I, you know, I definitely have students who do it every year. Um, but it's not going to get you into a school that you're not qualified to be at. It can give you a, you know, like I said, with a lot of the top schools, they can fill the class many times over with qualified students. So, you know, it gives you a little bit of a bump if you are already qualified.
Absolutely. Well, and finally, I just want to end with, you know, what students can get from you when they reach out to you for, law school admissions, advising and all of that? What can students expect from you?
Yeah, it's very easy. I work on an hourly basis for it, because I found that students vary dramatically in where they are in the process and how much help they need. So, I have a lot of students that, I'll just meet with them for an hour. We'll go through, they'll ask me all the questions that they have, and then that's all they need. And then other students I work with more long-term and intensively, who, need a little bit more support with all aspects of the process.
Mhm. And is it as simple as reaching out to you via email?
Yeah. Just you can my company website is vinikeps.com, VINIKEPS.com. Or you can just Google my name, because it's not a very common name, and it'll come up. And yeah, you can just email me.
All right. And any last words you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I would say don't be, there's all this, the media is very hyped up with, oh, this is the most, competitive law school application season in a decade or more. And applications are way up, and LSAT exams are way up. But, my students, for the most part, this year, everyone's kind of doing how I would expect them to do. I haven't seen dramatic changes. Sure, it's more competitive, but I think also students are just they're casting a wider net, because they're not able to, not that they do that much visiting anyway, but there's just so much uncertainty that I think students are just applying to more schools. But students are still getting into great schools, so don't let that scare you too much.
And do you think that uptick will apply to, fall 2022? Jesus, or and beyond? Or
it's hard to say. It always goes in cycles. So I'm sure it will level off. But this year there's COVID. People are kind of like, everyone's reassessing their lives and figuring out what to do. There were maybe international students who didn't want to come to the US in the past couple of years and are now ready to come again. So there's a lot of different factors. But it goes in waves, and it's all fine.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. This has been so informative. I got so many answers to my questions that I personally had, and hopefully everyone here listening in got a lot of questions as well, or questions answered as well. I don't see any questions in the chat. Oh, sorry, I did not see this. Alyssa asked, oh, okay. So going back to, I'm sorry to skip back. The optional essays, diversity statement, addendas, all of that, maybe secondary essays as well. Is that something that someone can send after their application is into the school?
Yeah, that's, in the case with that student I mentioned with his diversity statement, he sent it after. But I wouldn't recommend like deliberately going with that approach. I would just wait until, I would wait until you were ready, and I would send everything together, because, you never know if they're going to make a decision on, a lot of times I will have questions from students like, I'm taking another LSAT, but I want to apply earlier in the cycle. Like, should I send it? Or I'm waiting for a recommendation letter that's not ready yet. And basically what law schools say is like, we no guarantees. Like, once you send it, like, we can review it at any time. We're not waiting for things that are not required. They're not even going to, if you're missing something that's required, then obviously they're going to wait. But I think it's risky, and I think it just like looks weird. So I would just
a little bit. Yeah. Sorry for the back and forth on that. But thank you so much for answering all our questions. And thank you for your time. This has been wonderful speaking to you. And I hope everyone had, gotten some of their questions answered. So thank you so much, Laura. Hopefully some people reach out to you.
All right. Good luck.
Thank you.
Sure. Bye.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.